Doug, did you find it as annoying as I do to have to wear this thing? Ah, you cheater. They picked you up pretty good. How'd they pick you up so good? We'll be back in Galatians chapter 5. Miss Pat, you got to tell Angie, I was very quiet. I had no response to any of that, a lot of thoughts. I'll take that up here. Galatians chapter 5. I do want to thank Doug for his challenge last week. If this wasn't what it was supposed to be, Doug, this is what I heard. I heard a challenge to grow in grace and mercy, which is going to show itself in forgiveness and understanding. So if that's not how you meant it, that's how my heart heard it. So that must have been what I needed. And I do appreciate it. Thank you. Galatians chapter 5, our focus this morning is going to be on verses 13 through 15. Verse 13, for brethren, ye have been called unto liberty, which sounds like we're at the exact place we left off 2 weeks ago, which is chapter 5, verse 1. Stand fast, therefore, in the liberty wherewith Christ hath made us free. You're free, be free, defend freedom. Freedom is important. Freedom is part of the gospel. Freedom is key. Verse 4, just so you know, you make Christ become of no effect if you muddy this freedom. Verse 7, which was a huge verse to me, ye did run well. Who did hinder you that you should not obey the truth, which was very important to me. Dr. Bohr, that was important to me because, you know what, sometimes I struggle in this area, and I don't want to be an Ishmael and wondering whether I'm on the outside, not a child of promise. So right here, it gets me that verse 7, ye did run well. So some of us, we're not exactly an Ishmael. I'm only guilty of being dumb. Okay, and I'm okay with that. Just don't make me an Ishmael. So we get to verse 7. There was some actually relief in verse 7. Verse 8. This persuasion cometh not of him that calleth you, meaning Christ did not put this law, but he is not putting you back under bondage. Then verse 9 is the big warning. A little leaven leaveneth the whole lump. And again, usually this verse is taken out of context where it's talking about a little leaven leaven is sin. And okay, all of those things are true. So Tony, we can do those things. But right here where it's written right there, a little leaven, it's talking about a little law. A little legalism ruins the whole thing. This whole chapter is about legalism. It ties back to chapter 4, which is about legalism. It goes back to chapter 3, where he's defending and he's calling us to freedom. A little legalism ruins it all. Don't think you can bring in a little and it's okay. A little makes Christ of no effect. And so he's fighting for all of this, and then he gets to verse 13. And at verse 13, brethren, we have been called unto liberty. We're right back where we started. And with that, we haven't prayed, so let's go to the Lord in prayer this morning. Father, I thank you for the day you've given us. I thank you for those who are here this morning. I thank you for your word. And as we bring our lives under the microscope of your word, Lord, I ask that the Holy Spirit would be the teacher this morning. I ask that you would prepare our hearts and make them receptive, make them wanting to follow after you, make our feet willing to follow. Lord, just make things clear so that we can understand, that we can be more like you. Lord, as we enter into this week in our country, Lord, I pray for wisdom. I've been so disillusioned in this last week, hearing so many stories of Christians or even those who stood behind the pulpit who are now pushing and crying out to be the victim. There's no victims in Christianity, Lord. Your feet were weary on the road to Calvary. The cross was heavy upon your back. And we are called to be the same thing. Lord, help us to live out life as you've called us to be. Bless this hour we have this morning and continue to bless in the following week. Pray these things in your name. Amen. Galatians 5:13. For brethren, ye have been called unto liberty. Doug, I've been asked, why don't you just skip over this? You know, we covered this in verse 1 of chapter 5. Why don't you skip over it in verse 13? And I actually I do have an answer, and it is very much who I am and how I believe we should study. It also ties to why I believe that there are so many weaknesses in the church. And that is because that's exactly what we want to do. We want to skip around. We want to grab things. We want to take them out of context. We say we want to take them out of context, and that gives us the right to take them out of context. And we say we didn't take this out of context, and it's just this big confusing mess. We do not like to study line by line, but it is valuable because when we go line by line, precept by precept, what it does is it's repetitive. Well, you know, teacher, you know how students learn? Repetition. Preacher was telling me this morning, printer wouldn't work, and so he comes down to print his sermon every Sunday morning. Printer wouldn't work, and he was like, well, I guess I have to do like they taught us in college. In college, they taught us to type it, which was old typewriter days, so it took thought for most of them, and you'd have to think it through to type it, and then right before you would go forth to preach it, they would tell you to write it out, because that repetition brings it in here. Well, repetition is how we learn. And when we skip around and jump around, we're taking that repetition out. Yes, preacher, I just used you as an illustration. I did. Actually, I used your professor from college who told you to write it out. That repetition is how we learn. And we want to skip that because, I don't know, we're adults now, so we don't need the repetition. The man who programmed our brain understands what we need, and he writes it in repetition, and I don't want to skip over it. And there's a more crucial reason, and that's this. Especially in the writings of Paul. We've already seen this in this book multiple times. But Dr. Lewis, what Paul will do is, like he's doing right here, it's freedom, 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 freedom. Well, as soon as you start pounding freedom so hard, you know what the other side's going to say? They're going to start, well, all that freedom, now, and they start to accuse. So what Paul does is he covers one side, and then he'll cover the other side, and that's what he's about to do. He answers the argument before it's even heard. Brother Tony, when we jump around and we skip, we miss that second side, and we end up not being balanced. There's no tie. In fact, you can, here, I'm going to do this. Actually, Eric, bring up, are you back there? Isaiah chapter 28, verses 9 and 10. Put those up on the screen for me. How long is that going to take? It's computers, come on. It's not like he has to copy type it. Whom shall he teach knowledge, and whom shall he make to understand doctrine? Them that are weaned from the milk and drawn from the breast. So we would all, Brother Maury, we would go, that's me, that's me, that's me. I want to be mature, I want to be an adult, I want to be a leader, that's me. Okay? Look how this is written. For precept must be upon precept. And you know what the next sentence is? Precept upon precept. Precept must be upon precept, and let me give it to you again because that's how you learn. And then the next line upon line. And what's the next line? And line upon line. Because, Doug, that's how we learn. So I don't want to skip around because this is what I think. When we look at especially this idea of liberty, Christian liberty inside the church, there are three different groups. For the most part, we go to extremes. 3 different rows. This will work out well. So over there, let's see. Yes, this will work out well. So over on this side, we have the careful Christians. Okay? Careful Christians. A little nervous. All right, truly saved, not Ishmaels. But the fact is, anytime you say liberty, you get scared. So just give me just a little bit of law. Well, you know the problem with that, verse 9, a little bit of law. But that's okay. Just give me a little bit of law and it'll keep everything fine. Careful Christians. And then inside the church, you got this side. This is the carefree Christians. Well, that sounds bad. Why does it sound bad? We're supposed to be careful for nothing. You see, just that idea, Dr. Lewis, it sounded bad, didn't it? The carefree Christians, those who don't worry. Why does that sound bad? Because most of us would like be over there with a little nervous group. The careful group. We struggle to be in the careful group. That's why I like that part. You know, verse 7, because I know I'm just a dummy. Sometimes it just falls in there. So the careful group, carefree group. This is the group who's accepted their liberty. They've grown in it. Let me tell you, they choose to serve, but they choose to serve out of love, not out of guilt or out of burden. And as a result, they're full of joy. You know what that makes them? Carefree. And then over here you got over here you got Ben, the group that messes it all up. This is the careless Christians. Okay? Because they love, please, preacher, preach on freedom and liberty. Because every time you do, it just sounds like I can do whatever I want to. It becomes the excuse for me to be lazy. It becomes the excuse for me to quit. It becomes the excuse for me to heap upon my own lust all of my life. And so between these three, and I'm going to tell you why these three exist because we're not grounded. Which is why we're not going to speed through Galatians. Brother Hamilton, if you think we were slow so far, okay, we're rounding the curve into quicksand. It's about to get really slow. And I will not hurry through here. The preacher can kick me out of here. But as long as we're going through these books, this part is where we begin to grow. This is where it begins to make challenge. Because what happens with these three groups, this happens, my dad was in the military, I've been in a lot of churches. Here's what happens in every church I've ever been in. This side looks over there at that side. Doug, just look over there, Ben. Yep, that's a good one right there. Look over at Ben. Can you see what a mess? That is what happens when you preach on liberty. That's what happens when you talk about freedom. We need a little bit of law, a little bit of control. That's Paul's fight. No. Do you understand that Christ supplemented is Christ supplanted? When you add to him, boom. It's no more about him. It's about whatever you added. Do we have to go back to in chapter 3 and chapter 4? Paul spent 3 chapters doing that same exact conversation. No adding. But over here, you got this side. And you know what he says? He says, that man is so uptight. There is no joy. There is no hope. In fact, he becomes condemning and controlling, and I would never be like him in my whole life. And then there's this poor guy in the inside. We'll make it Dr. Lewis. Dr. Lewis is in here on the inside. And you know who he's talking to? You. So when he starts saying, look at that, he's pulling you. And you're like turning, yeah, there is a little truth to some of what he's saying. And then guess who he's talking to? He's talking to you. He's pulling you over there. And you're like, yeah, there is a little truth to that. And pretty soon you have a huge messed up thing and somebody is just trying to say, help. That's why Paul's been so slow. That's why we're not hurrying. Because there's something missing. What's missing in this picture is balance. And balance usually to us means, all right, let's get it mixed in the middle somewhere. No, I'm not talking about mix it in the middle. You can't add to it, and sin is not it. It's its own thing. But that thing that it is balances out the two extremes. And when we're not grounded, we go from extreme to extreme. There's a guy named I just forgot his first name. His last name's Hendrickson. And he has this illustration. I really liked it a lot. I don't even remember when I first heard it. I was a kid, probably. That means I was in my 20s. But he likens Christianity to a narrow log bridge. Just one single log. That's rounded too, not flat. I added that part. I didn't like the little flat thing. That makes it too easy. I was young then. Balance beam was not a big deal. So it's this round log. And it spans over 2 rivers. Now, I'll change this part of his illustration too, because he had those rivers run in opposite directions. That's not true. Those rivers are both running in the same direction. And it's going right over the middle of them. Now, Dr. Lewis, the river on this side, it's clean, and it's beautiful, and it's fresh, and it's like Montana. You can look in the bottom, and you can see the rocks down there. But it is also deadly, because it is rapid. And you can't control it, and it'll smash you against those rocks. And then the river on this other side, it's not even moving. It's nasty, and it stinks, and we'll say it oozes. Okay, well, this one looks so pretty and looks good. We're going to call that one legalism. And at the first look, Doug, it looks like, it's just, it looks, but you can jump in too. And you're going to work, and you're going to strive, and the flesh is going to be there, and you cannot get anywhere. It's just going to constantly roll you and turn you and beat you. And this one, it's just gross. And the problem is, once in a while, those rapids splash up some water on your bridge. It gets slippery. Once in a while, the ooze goes, it pops up on the bridge, and it gets slippery. And as you go down there, it begins to cause problems. And this is what happens. But I've been in church a long time, just like you. And I've seen this is what happens. Somebody will get in here, and for 10 years, they're fighting and rushing and working against the current. And after 10 years, they just say, I'm done. And they get out of the rapids. But you know where they go? I'm going to live life my way. I'm going to do what I want. And they hop right. Rarely do they hop up onto the bridge. And I've seen it the other way. Where, boom, they're straight in the ooze. And then sooner or later, this is just nasty. And they get out. And you know what they want? They become rigid and legal and judgmental and accusing. See, both rivers are heading the same way. Frustration, problematic, accomplish nothing, lack of joy. Doug, they end up in doubt. They go nowhere, so what's the use, and is it even real? And I have watched both eat up people that I have loved way too many times. We have been called to live between the streams, between legalism and lasciviousness. Now, how do you pull that off? Well, we need to hurry up so we can get some of this out, but obviously there's some easy answers. I mean, Treva, we're adults in here. We've been going to church a long time. We could answer that question, right? How do you pull that off? Well, we need to be taught the Bible, because when it splashes up and makes it a little bit slippery, you know what defines that we stay right here on the log? It's the Word of God. And it's pretty obvious. We need to praise and we need to worship daily, because you know what that does? That keeps your eyes on the one we love. That keeps the dedication there. In fact, I'll tell you, just those two things makes it a whole lot more simple for the Spirit to lead us in our prayer life, to lead us in our service life, to bring into remembrance those things that we've been taught at the exact time that we need it. But this is key. How can it bring into us, to our remembrance, the things we've never remembered? So, it's Bible study, worship, praise, makes that third part really easy. We've all heard sermons. I know that because I've heard them right here in that chair back there, or before I was so backslidden in the chair right there. But then when Doug moved back, I had to move back. Keep the distance. He's loud. Hurts my ears. And this is what happens. Preacher, when you preach a sermon on holiness, if I'm not careful, this is what I hear. I hear the extreme. I hear a whole lot of duty and a whole lot of law. Or when you preach one on freedom, I just hear a whole lot of feels good, do it. Where's the control? If we're not careful, we just swing back and forth between extremes. This is where Paul catches himself right here in verse 13. What do you think Paul was being accused of after all of this freedom stuff? He was being accused of, where's the law? What are you doing? If people are free, then there's no control. So what Paul is about to do is answer the accusation. Paul is setting aside the moral law. Now we know Paul's not setting aside the moral law. In fact, he's exalting the moral law. Paul would be the one who would go back and reference Jeremiah when Jeremiah would give us the new covenant and tell us that the law is now going to be written where? Inside on your heart. He exalts it. He's not tearing down the moral law. The moral law is the very character of God. Because God is truth, that's why you don't lie. God is immutable. He's never changing. The moral law does not change. In fact, it's now written on the inside, the desires of our heart. God will give us the desires of our heart. You know how that happens? Because we have a new heart, and that heart has new desires because the law is written on the inside. Too often deal with young people, so this is what happened. Too often I hear, Tony, I hear this. 18-year-old guy. I love that 18-year-old girl with all my heart. What? With all my heart. And God says it'll be the desires of my heart. Since that's the desire of my heart, she must be for me God's will. That's how we determine it. No. The desires of our heart comes because the immutable God has written his very character inside of us. We become children of God, and that's what we seek after. And that's why he'll gladly give us those desires, because he's just growing us up in his nurture and admonition. So, here we go. Skip over this. Two things, because we only got 15 minutes. This is where we're going to end up, Doug. We're going to end up with this idea. Two things. Understand two things about this freedom. One, understand that freedom is not license. And hopefully we'll see that. And whatever's supposed to go there, also understand that holiness is not legalism. And that's where we'll start to get, hopefully. Galatians 5, verse 13. For brethren, us, Christians, saved men, brothers and sisters, we have been called unto liberty. What he's about to do is clarify this call. We have been called. We have been placed in this cycle where God started it. Called by who? God called us. God purchased us. God will complete it. What is the it he called us to? Liberty. Brought this out last week, and I believe this is something we should think about. Brother Roy, you know, if you talk to the world, sometimes we make it sound like they're the bad guys. Only by the grace of God, I'm not them. But we talk to the world, and we talk to them about the church. You know what the world's picture of the church is? So I don't want to be in the church because it's bondage, because they're going to tie me down, because I don't know how we got to that. Because the very core of the gospel is liberty. It's freedom. So that's just something we should think about as we paint the picture of who God is and what we're like. But this whole call began and was started by God. And then Paul's about to write this. Here it is. He's about to go into this other side, Doug. He's about to deal with the, okay, you're going to accuse me of these things. Let's go into it. So what he's saying right here in the beginning is, okay, what I say when I'm about to say what I'm about to say, don't let it negate what I've already said. I mean, we've already spent all this time on liberty. Whatever you do, don't let that falter. Don't let go of that. Hopefully I've won that. But now, let's look at this, what liberty is not. And so he starts out, for brethren, get this through, you have been called to liberty. Don't yield on that. Only use not liberty for an occasion to the flesh, but by love serve one another. Verse 14, for all the law is fulfilled in one word, even in this, thou shalt love thy neighbor as thyself. But if ye bite and devour one another, take heed that ye be not consumed one of another. Verse 16, this I say then, walk in the Spirit, and ye shall not fulfill the lusts of the flesh. I think what he does is he's about to give us three things. Okay, Brother Moyer, hold fast, stand fast in the liberty wherewith you have been called. And then verse 13, don't forget this, you're called to liberty. But now let me give you three things liberty is not. Let me clarify this call. There are three things that liberty is not. One, liberty is not free to pursue sin. Use not liberty. Remember when we were in the very beginning? Ben, in the very beginning, we're talking about false teachers. We made this statement, false teachers don't come into the church and say, Christ isn't God, there's no such thing as grace. No, they come in and they just twist it a little bit. They just add. Okay, what he's talking about right here, use not your liberty. Preacher, all he's doing is just, here's the twist. See the twist? See the perversion? Okay, liberty is good, but don't let it be twisted. I'm not compromising on the liberty. I'm not letting it go. I'm fighting for what it is. Don't let it be twisted. Much of our Christian life is all about definitions to specific words. Don't let it be twisted. Don't use it. Okay. That phrase there, use not liberty for an occasion. Doug, that's actually a picture of like jumping off. That's like military term. That's a beachhead. We're going to go jump into Cuba. Boom, we land, we establish one area, we strengthen one area, and then we fight off from that area. Don't use your liberty to establish a beachhead to fight off into the lasciviousness of the world. Because that's not what it is. But by love, okay. Brethren, ye have been called unto liberty. Don't use liberty for an occasion to the flesh, but by love serve one another. I'm a picture guy. Okay, so I need a picture because this is starting to we have a great picture. Exodus chapter 21. It's a great picture. So, I'm free, but I'm supposed to choose to love, and that's how I use my freedom. Because here, I'm free. I'm free to do that. That free is not to be consumed upon my own lust, but that freedom is supposed to be used somehow, how and where, and however it is used, and whatever I do with it, it's all controlled by love. So how does this work? Exodus chapter 21, verse 1. Now these are the judgments which thou shalt set before them. If thou buy a Hebrew servant, 6 years shall he serve, and in the 7th he shall go out free for nothing. 6 years, 7 years, he's free. On the 7th year, boom, freedom. Okay, that's what he's talking about. If he came in by himself, he shall go out by himself. If he were married, then his wife shall go out with him. If his master hath given him a wife, and he shall be born sons or daughters, the wife and her children shall be her masters, and he shall go out by himself. And if the servant shall plainly say, I love my master, my wife, and my children, I will not go out free. Then his master shall bring him unto the judges. He shall also bring him to the door or unto the doorpost. And his master shall bore his ear through with an awl, and he shall serve him forever. Doug, here's a picture of using your freedom and choosing to serve in love. I love this picture. You know, bond servant. Miss Kathy, I am a servant for years, but he treats me so well, and he loves me so much. Provide for me everything I need, and life is just what I want. And he says to me, you are free. Freedom is what I give you. And I say, my freedom chooses to serve you with all my life. I'll never replace. I'll never have better. There's nothing that can top you. See, use not your freedom to heap upon your own lust, but use it by love to serve. Ooh, gotta hurry. Let me give you just something to think about. I'm 52 years old. In 52 years, I've probably spent 30 years working with young people in some form or fashion. And I've watched a lot of things. I've watched a lot of young people not taught about freedom or liberty from the Word of God. Out of fear, it's all about control. And don't give me, all right, don't swing all the way to the other pendulum and say, let some 8-year-old make up their own mind and decide their own life. Okay, I'm not going to the pendulum. I'm talking about teaching biblical freedom, teaching liberty, teaching how God treats us. You know what? God gives us a choice. That is amazing that the God and creator of heaven gives us choice. Let's teach that. Okay, but I've watched young people who haven't grown up with an atmosphere. Brother Moore, they haven't grown up with an atmosphere of choice and of love and of freedom. And what happens is they come to a place in their life when they get it. Freedom. Maybe that's college. Maybe that's moving out. I don't know. It's financial opportunity. Well, preacher, when you grow up under freedom, it's all a choice. But when you grow up under the burden of the thumb of law, which is what Paul paints the picture of for 3 chapters to make sure we understand. This is what law does to us. What he does is he comes and frees us from that prison. But Doug, when all I feel like is I'm in prison with no freedom and no liberty, and it comes to me, oftentimes, I go crazy. And then we end up like the prodigal father, waiting for them to end up in a pig pen and come back home. I'm not talking about any specific incident. I'm just telling you, freedom is that important. Freedom ought to be how the church is known. It ought to be how Christ, it ought to be what we preach, he gives us and he teaches us. It ought to be what we hold precious. I'm afraid if I be lifted up, I'll draw all men to me. Let's make a better picture of who he is. He is beautiful and he is wonderful. And who would want to leave him if we paint him or who he is? But we paint him as like, scooping up the field mice, bash him on the head. Cosmic cop. Oh, that we might start living in freedom. Christ supplanted, Christ replaced. Christ supplemented, Christ replaced, Christ supplanted. So here's this picture. Lord, here it is. Nail me. I will gladly be your bond servant. Choose in love to serve. Doctor, you really think that person who just had his ear nailed to the side of the doorpost needs a list of rules? In fact, I'll tell you, he probably resents it. I want to be recognized for my love, for my commitment. Then he goes into this area of let's get specific. He applies the call. Freedom is not the freedom to injure others. Through love, serve one another. Here you go, carefree Christian. Here you go, carefree Christian. Understand this, that some, they yearn for rules. Now, I'm very key on this. You go to Romans chapter 14. You can read that whole chapter. I challenge you, read that whole chapter. But you pay attention to verse 1 where it calls those weak. Okay, because you're going to have a tough time heaping on me for the younger and the immature to always have to give in to supposed stronger. But for the weak, here's the idea. There are some who yearn for rules. They're easily bruised. They're weak. They're young. They struggle. He says, don't use your freedom to trample on them. In fact, that word serve, you know what that word serve is? It's the same word for bond servant. But because you're choosing, don't stomp all over them. And this is where, Romans chapter 14 talks about meat. It talks about wine. It talks about giving in so that you don't hurt and become a stumbling block. What's a stumbling block? It's stopping the progress. You know what happens if we don't? Dr. Boyer, you know what happens if we don't yield to the weak once in a while? I'm not talking about compromise. I'm not talking about should you read your Bible or not, or is murder okay, or should you steal. We're not talking about moral character of God. But you know what happens if you don't? Well, he tells us what happens if you don't. It's right there in those verses. If you don't, Galatians chapter 5, verse 15. But if ye bite and devour one another, take heed that ye be not consumed one of another. Doug, you know what happens if you don't? This side points at that side, and they talk to this side, come on my side of the army, and that side points to that side, and they talk to this side, come on my side of the army. And what kind of growth do you think you have going on right there? You become a grown-up babysitter. Try to keep everyone quiet. Where's the maturity? Where's the growth? Where's the commitment to Christ? Because all we're doing is talking about this list or this rule or that rule or how much or how long or what color. These young people in Romans 14 got saved. They're Jews. They've grown up. They've known Sabbath. They've known rule. They've known dietary. And he said, look, it might be hard for them to let go of all of that. So don't stomp on them. And we could split the church today most times if we just talked about Disney movies. I'm serious. Split the church. Doctrine of Disney movies. Can't find that, but should you watch them? Should you watch them in the movie? If you've even watched them on a DVD. Now, can you stream them? We have nothing better to commit to chase after, and to see, and to praise. Verse 14, because we're running out of time. For all the law is fulfilled in one word, even in this, thou shalt love thy neighbor as thyself. We're not free to consume it upon ourselves. We're not free to injure others, and we're not free to ignore the law. And what does it say right there? All the law is fulfilled in one word, even this. Even what? Love thy neighbor as thyself. Romans chapter 13, verses 8 through 10. Owe no man anything but to love one another. For he that loveth another hath fulfilled the law. He that loveth another fulfilled the law. For this, thou shalt not commit adultery, because you wouldn't do that if you love the other person. Thou shalt not kill, because how can you kill the person if you want their best interest? Thou shalt not steal. How can I take what from you and consume it for me? If I love you and I'm committed for your best interest, thou shalt not bear false witness. Thou shalt not covet. If there be any other commandment, it is briefly comprehended in this saying, namely, thou shalt love thy neighbor as thyself. Love worketh no ill to his neighbor. Therefore, love is the fulfilling of the law. I am free. Dr. Boyer, that means I am not bound to any religious system, but I am bound to a law, one law. I have chosen to be bound to the law of Christ. Nail me right there. And the law of Christ says I am to love others. I am to prefer others. I am to do good, especially unto those of the household of faith. Now, because here's where we get to. How do you get people to start walking upon that bridge and live upon that bridge and not constantly jumping into the ooze and jumping into the rapids and jumping into the ooze and jumping into the rapids? Well, verse 16, Galatians chapter 5. This I say then. Boom. Sounds like he's almost, moving on to the next. It sounds like he almost means, okay, now I've built this problem. Here's how we're going to solve it. Because that's what he is saying. Here's how we're going to solve it. I know that sounds problematic, but here's how you pull that off. Walk in the Spirit, and you shall not fulfill the lusts of the flesh. And this is where we'll begin to look next week. Will you close in a word of prayer?